Pigeons have been a vital part of combat starting as early as the late 19th century when France used them during the Siege of Paris in the Franco-Prussian War. 800 pigeons sent over 40,000 messages during that historic conquest. A few years later, in 1896, the French shipping company, Compagnie Transatlantique, sent pigeons flying over the oceans for the first time. The older pigeons were able to survive this journey, even in the harsh weather conditions, while the younger ones died after falling in the sea. World War I, however, was the first widespread instance of military pigeon usage. These birds could be found in every branch of service, providing the most help on the front lines. Oftentimes, the messages they sent were able to save hundreds of lives. Despite the new addition of technologies like the telephone, telegraph, and even radios, pigeons were chosen for their reliability. When communication lines were intercepted by the enemy, pigeons could still get a message out quickly and safely. The U.S. Army Signal Corps finally established a pigeon service in 1917, and its widespread success is what eventually inspired the continuation of this practice into the Second World War.
Well, pigeons in general were extremely critical because there was only 2 or 3 forms of communication. One was verbal communication, person to person, which means that somebody would have to take a vehicle or jeep or run. And the other form of communication was via telephone with a landline, running cables very long, many miles. And of course, the enemy would cut the cables. So the only other form of communication was on land now were pigeons.
Between World War I and World War II, communications improved drastically, but pigeons were still an imperative part of the newest war efforts. At this time, they were used mostly in emergency or supplemental situations, but their jobs did vary from branch to branch. Most often, they were sending messages to and from the battlefields, communicating with intelligence operatives, or confirming the location of a unit. However, what truly set pigeons apart was their ability to send photos and maps back and forth. Unlike radio, anything small enough to fit in the bird's capsule could be sent via pigeon.
One of the beauties of the pigeon is you could use it to not have to send coded messages. Unless you're really concerned that that message might be intercepted or whatever's in the message is extremely sensitive, you don't have to code it, right? And every time you have to decode that message takes a lot of time.
Pigeons were an integral part of the war effort for both the Allied and Axis powers. The Allied forces used pigeons most commonly to send messages of importance to troops. This provided them a sense of security and privacy in their communication with one another. On the other hand, the Axis powers used pigeons mainly to echolocate opposing troops, and then report back to their home lofts. This allowed them to prepare for attacks and ambushes by the Allied troops. Most pigeons were recruited from fancier associations, but they were also bred within the units. In 1941, a census of all United States racing pigeon lofts was conducted. Birds were being purchased for up to $5 each, but were usually given as gifts or donations. The American Racing Pigeon Union was just one group to provide support to the drive as they donated the healthy mass of birds they had access to. The media also promoted this call for pigeons through newspaper articles. The famous headline by a Brooklyn paper, "Cheer Up Men, Birds May Also Be Drafted," caught national attention, drawing more pigeons to services. Ultimately, the United States Pigeon Service was able to provide 54,000 of these flying fighters compared to only 3,000 human soldiers in World War II. By late 1943, the Signal Corps had enough pigeons to maintain its own breeding program. The goal was to breed the strongest, fastest birds with the best possible homing instincts. While pigeons could fly about 200 miles on average during the First World War, the length had more than doubled by the Second. Some could even fly up to 600 miles in harsh conditions. Their typical speed was about 35 to 40 miles per hour, but could be up to 60 miles per hour when flying short distances. The training of these pigeons started from the moment they were born, and then after only 8 weeks of life, they were sent to war. Shortly after birth, chicks were transferred to mobile lofts. Short flights in the mornings, afternoons, and nights allowed them to practice and gain a better understanding of their surroundings. By the time they had enough stamina to fly for an hour, they were considered ready for combat.
And the remarkable thing is a pigeon literally begins its military training practically from the moment it is hatched. And a pigeon will continuously be trained to not just home, but home successfully and fly faster, stronger, more accurately. Like I said, from hatch till it's about 7 or 10 years of age.
The UK's pigeon service was a quick success, inspiring America to expand its own. They began working on ways to utilize the birds more in airborne missions, starting with the development of a special vest. This was a sling-like contraption created by a brassiere company, Maidenform. The vest allowed pigeons to be strapped to the chest of paratroopers as they were parachuted through the sky. After landing behind enemy lines, paratroopers could release the pigeons to deliver messages. Maidenform made more than 28,000 pigeon vests, along with thousands of parachutes. This shift from peacetime production into necessary war materials was common for large companies at the time. The most famous instance of military pigeon usage by the Allied powers in World War II was in Operation Columba. This secret mission was issued by the United Kingdom in April of 1941 in order to collect information from the citizens of countries under German rule.
So the British are in an information blackout. They really don't know what's going on in occupied France or occupied Belgium, occupied Holland. They have no idea. So they finally get the green light to use the pigeons. And the concept here is if they're flying these little light planes over the channel at night to try and bring in secret agents, it's very risky, right, to put a human in the ground. If the Germans catch them, they're going to torture them, they're going to interrogate them, they're going to find out what the British are up to, probably kill the person, which they end up doing. Pigeons are expendable. We don't like to think that way as a creature, but they really are expendable assets, and they're cheap. And that's the other important thing. It's not a human being. It's cheap. So the British kind of on a roll of the dice say, well, let's try it. Maybe this will work. Maybe it won't.
Operation Columba released 2,040 pigeons from the UK and trained them to travel hundreds of miles to countries such as northern France and Belgium. The pigeons carried small questionnaires for the citizens of these countries asking about the actions of German troops. These questionnaires were inside a little capsule that was attached to the ankle of the bird. After the citizens filled out the form, they would put it back into the capsule and the birds would find their way back home. This operation was widely viewed as a success, with many citizens replying to this need for information. 50% of the pigeons returned to the United Kingdom with completed questionnaires. The mission mainly collected information about the location of German troops in Belgium and France, giving an advantage to the Allied powers during battle. Not too long after, the Army developed special cages and parachutes for dropping pigeons in areas with isolated troops and no other means of communication. Thousands of these devices were used in the June 1944 Normandy invasion, where once again, French civilians were asked to provide information about German installations and troop movements. Some of the first reports of the D-Day landings came from Gustav, a pigeon who flew 5 hours to England cross-channel. He later became one of just a few pigeons to win the Dickin Medal of Honor for his bravery and reliability. Though many of these operations during World War II were a success, many pigeons died along the way. In one British drop of about 16,000 birds over France, less than 2,000 returned home. That is almost a 90% rate of losses. Pigeons were also eaten by hawks and eagles mid-operation. Opposing countries often issued soldiers shotguns for the sole purpose of shooting down pigeons.
The Germans became very effective in capturing hawks and falcons and training them to take down pigeons. Obviously, if you had a rifle and there's a small bird, a 16-ounce bird flying through the air at 60 miles an hour, you really need a shotgun, but a shotgun is not an effective weapon for a military.
During World War II, pigeons were a valuable resource of communication for the Allied powers. They were a secure way to carry messages across long distances. Only 6% of messages carried by pigeons were intercepted, as opposed to radio, which was intercepted 27% of the time. By the war's end, the pigeon service sent approximately 30,000 pigeons overseas, and 96% reached their destination. Many pigeons were awarded the Dickin Medal of Honor for their valiant efforts during the war, but as technology progressed, the need for pigeons minimized. In 1957, the pigeon service was disbanded, and most of the pigeons were sold in auctions. Oftentimes, these pigeons were returned to the Army after their death, to be preserved and displayed in military museums. Rarely discussed is the use of pigeons during World War II, despite the important role they played. Yes, the war could have been won without the birds, but they made communications more secure and oftentimes easier. We honor these brave flying fighters, remembering that communication is a vital part of history. With access to new technologies, today's generations could never imagine sending messages this way. But without pigeons and their contributions to war efforts, thousands more lives could have been lost in the tragedy that was the Second World War.